I was standing in my driveway in Scottsdale, Arizona, admiring the newly installed 70-foot ham radio tower in my backyard when a silver BMW pulled up to my curb like it owned the entire street. Out stepped a woman in her late 40s with a blonde bob cut so sharp it could slice through steel, wearing a pantsuit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. She had that look on her face, the one that said she was about to ruin someone's day, and I had a sinking feeling that someone was me. "Excuse me," she called out, her heels clicking against my driveway with the precision of a metronome. "Are you the homeowner here?" I turned to face her, wiping my hands on my jeans. "Yes, madam. I'm Wesley Kellerman. Can I help you?" Her eyes narrowed as she glanced past me at the tower rising behind my house. "I'm Brenda Patterson, president of the Saguaro Heights Homeowners Association. I need to speak with you about that monstrosity you've erected on your property." I felt my jaw tighten. I had been expecting this conversation, but I had hoped I would have more time to enjoy my new tower before the HOA came knocking. I'd spent months planning this installation, saving up the money and making sure everything was done by licensed professionals. This tower was my dream, my connection to amateur radio operators around the world, and I was not about to let someone like Brenda Patterson take it away from me. "That tower is completely legal," I said, keeping my voice calm and measured. "I have all the proper permits from the city, and it meets all safety requirements." Brenda's lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't care what permits you have from the city. According to our HOA covenants, conditions, and restrictions, no structure over 15 feet in height may be erected without express written approval from the Architectural Review Committee. That tower is clearly in violation." I had read those CCRs front to back before I bought this house 3 years ago, and I knew exactly what they said. What Brenda did not know was that I had also done my homework on federal law, specifically the PRB1 regulation that protects amateur radio operators from exactly this kind of harassment. "With all due respect, Mrs. Patterson, federal law supersedes your HOA rules when it comes to amateur radio facilities. The FCC has regulations in place that prevent homeowners associations from completely prohibiting ham radio antennas." Her face flushed red. "I don't know what you're talking about, but I can assure you that this association takes its rules very seriously. You have 30 days to remove that tower, or we will begin fining you $500 per day until it comes down. You'll be receiving formal notice in the mail." She turned on her heel and marched back to her BMW, leaving me standing there with a mixture of anger and frustration bubbling up inside me. I had been a licensed amateur radio operator for 15 years, ever since I was 22 years old. Ham radio was not just a hobby for me. It was a passion that had gotten me through some of the darkest times in my life. After my father passed away when I was in college, sitting at the radio and talking to people from around the world had been my therapy, my way of feeling connected when everything else felt like it was falling apart. I walked back into my house and immediately pulled up the FCC website on my computer. I needed to arm myself with the exact language of the regulations before this situation escalated any further. PRB1, officially known as the Federal Preemption of Amateur Radio Regulations, was issued by the FCC in 1985 to prevent local zoning authorities and private land use restrictions from completely prohibiting amateur radio communications. The regulation stated that while HOAs could impose reasonable restrictions on antenna installations, they could not prevent effective amateur radio communications. The key word was reasonable. An outright ban or restrictions that made it impossible to communicate were not reasonable under federal law. I printed out copies of the regulation, along with several court cases where ham radio operators had successfully challenged HOA restrictions. I also sent an email to my attorney, Marcus Chen, explaining the situation and asking him to review everything before I responded to the formal notice from the HOA. 3 days later, the notice arrived in my mailbox. It was a thick envelope with the HOA logo embossed on the front, and inside was a 5-page letter detailing my alleged violations. According to Brenda Patterson and her Architectural Review Committee, I was in violation of Section 7.3 of the CCRs, which prohibited structures over 15 feet without approval. The letter demanded that I submit a written plan for removal of the tower within 30 days, or face daily fines starting at $500. I called Marcus immediately. "Wesley, I've been looking over the materials you sent me," he said when he picked up. "You have a strong case here. PRB1 is well-established law, and there are plenty of precedents in your favor. But I need to warn you, fighting an HOA can be expensive and time-consuming. These associations have deep pockets and they don't like to lose. I'm not backing down on this, Marcus. This tower is important to me, and what they're trying to do is illegal under federal law. I want to fight this." "All right then. Let me draft a response letter explaining your position and citing the relevant regulations. We'll send it to the HOA board and see if we can resolve this without going to court." Over the next 2 weeks, I continued using my ham radio tower every evening after work. I made contacts with operators in Japan, Australia, Germany, and Brazil. The tower was working beautifully, and every conversation I had reinforced my determination to keep it standing. My neighbors on either side, the Hendersons and the Rawlings, had no problem with it. They had even stopped by to ask questions about how it worked, and I had enjoyed explaining the technical aspects of radio propagation and antenna theory. But not everyone in the neighborhood was as accepting. I started noticing cars slowing down as they passed my house, drivers craning their necks to stare at the tower. I received a few anonymous notes in my mailbox, calling the tower an eyesore and demanding that I take it down. One particularly nasty note suggested that I was probably using the tower to spy on my neighbors, which was both absurd and insulting. Marcus sent his response letter to the HOA on a Friday afternoon. In it, he carefully explained the provisions of PRB1 and how they applied to my situation. He noted that my tower was a necessary component of my amateur radio station and that the HOA's blanket prohibition on structures over 15 feet effectively prevented me from engaging in effective amateur radio communications. He requested that the HOA withdraw its violation notice and work with me to establish reasonable accommodation guidelines that would satisfy both federal law and the association's legitimate aesthetic concerns. The response from Brenda Patterson came faster than I expected. On Monday morning, I received a phone call from an unknown number. When I answered, her voice came through the speaker sharp and hostile. "Mr. Kellerman, I received your attorney's letter, and I have to say, I am extremely disappointed in your attitude. Instead of working with this association to find a solution, you've chosen to hide behind some obscure federal regulation. I want you to know that this board will not be intimidated by legal threats." "Mrs. Patterson, I'm not trying to intimidate anyone. I'm simply exercising my rights under federal law. I'm more than happy to work with the board on reasonable accommodations, but I'm not removing my tower." "That tower is a blight on this neighborhood, Mr. Kellerman. It lowers property values and creates a safety hazard. Several of your neighbors have contacted me expressing their concerns." "Which neighbors?" I asked, because the people who live right next to me have been nothing but supportive. "I'm not at liberty to disclose that information, but I can tell you that this board has consulted with our attorney, and we are prepared to take legal action if necessary. You will be hearing from us again very soon." She hung up before I could respond. I sat there for a moment, staring at my phone and feeling the weight of what was coming. I had known this would not be easy, but I had not anticipated the level of hostility I was facing. Brenda Patterson was not just enforcing HOA rules. She seemed to be taking this personally, as if my tower was a direct challenge to her authority. That evening, I attended a monthly meeting of the Scottsdale Amateur Radio Club at the local community center. I had been a member for 5 years, and these meetings were always a highlight of my month. They gave me a chance to connect with other operators, learn about new technologies, and share experiences. When I walked into the meeting room, my friend Daniel Rourke waved me over to an empty seat. "Hey, Wesley, how's the new tower working out?" "The tower's great," I said, settling into my chair, "but I'm having some trouble with my HOA. They want me to take it down." Several heads turned in my direction. HOA disputes were unfortunately common among amateur radio operators, and everyone had a story or knew someone who had fought similar battles. An older man named Victor Paulson leaned forward. "Did you cite PRB1? "Yeah, my attorney sent them a letter explaining the federal preemption rules. But the HOA president is digging in her heels. She's threatening to fine me $500 a day if I don't take it down." Victor shook his head. "These HOAs never learn. I had a similar fight back in 2019 with my association in Tempe. They tried to make me remove my antenna, and I had to take them to federal court. Cost me $15,000 in legal fees, but I won. The judge ruled that their restrictions were unreasonable under PRB1 and ordered them to pay my attorney's fees. That's what I'm hoping to avoid, I said. I don't want this to turn into a protracted legal battle, but I'm not backing down. The club president, a retired engineer named Harold Vinson, spoke up from the front of the room. If you need any support, Wesley, this club has your back. We can provide expert testimony about the necessity of your tower for effective communications. We've done it before for other members. The show of solidarity made me feel better, but I knew the road ahead was going to be difficult. After the meeting, I drove home and spent an hour on the radio, making contacts and trying to clear my head. There was something deeply peaceful about sitting in my radio room, hearing voices from around the world crackling through the static, knowing that my signals were bouncing off the ionosphere and traveling thousands of miles. 2 weeks later, I received another letter from the HOA. This one was even thicker than the first, and when I opened it, I found a formal legal complaint. The Saguaro Heights Homeowners Association was filing suit against me in Maricopa County Superior Court, seeking an injunction to force me to remove my tower and asking for reimbursement of their legal fees. According to the complaint, my tower violated the CCRs and posed an imminent danger to the community. I immediately called Marcus and scheduled a meeting at his office. When I arrived the next morning, he had the complaint spread out on his desk, marked up with notes and highlights. They're going aggressive, Marcus said, leaning back in his chair. But honestly, this is not surprising. HOAs hate losing control, and they have a tendency to escalate before they're willing to negotiate. The good news is that their complaint is weak. They're relying entirely on the CCRs and ignoring PRB1 completely. So what do? We file a response denying their allegations and asserting your federal rights. Then we file a motion to dismiss based on federal preemption. I'm confident we can win this, Wesley, but it's going to take time and money. I estimate we're looking at $20,000 to $30,000 in legal fees if this goes all the way to trial. I felt my stomach drop. I had some savings, but that kind of money would wipe me out. Is there any way to speed this up or reduce the costs? We can try to get a quick ruling on the motion to dismiss. If the judge understands PRB1, he might throw out their case before it ever goes to trial. But judges can be unpredictable, especially when it comes to federal regulations they're not familiar with. Let's do it. File whatever we need to file. Over the next month, the legal maneuvering began in earnest. Marcus filed our response and motion to dismiss, and the HOA's attorney, a stern woman named Patricia Greenfield, filed a response opposing our motion. Both sides submitted legal briefs, and a hearing was scheduled for early October. During this time, the tension in my neighborhood became palpable. Brenda Patterson had clearly been talking to other residents, trying to drum up opposition to my tower. I started receiving more anonymous notes, and someone even left a printed petition on my doorstep, demanding that I remove the dangerous and unsightly tower immediately. The petition had 23 signatures, though I noticed that none of them were from my immediate neighbors. I also noticed that Brenda had started driving past my house multiple times a day, sometimes slowing down to take pictures of the tower with her phone. It was clear she was building a case, documenting what she saw as evidence of my violations. One Saturday afternoon in late September, I was in my garage working on some equipment when I heard raised voices outside. I walked out to find Brenda Patterson standing in my driveway, arguing with my neighbor Tom Henderson. This tower is a safety hazard, Brenda was saying, her voice shrill. What happens when it falls over in a storm? It could kill someone. Tom, a laid-back software engineer in his 30s, crossed his arms. The tower is professionally installed and engineered to withstand winds up to 90 miles per hour. I've seen the specs. It's safer than half the trees in this neighborhood. You don't know what you're talking about, Brenda snapped. Actually, I do. I'm an engineer. And I think you're harassing Wesley because you don't like losing control. Brenda's face turned bright red. How dare you speak to me that way? I am the president of this HOA, and I have every right to enforce our rules. You have a right to enforce reasonable rules, Tom said. You don't have the right to violate federal law. I decided to intervene before things got any more heated. Mrs. Patterson, I think it's time for you to leave my property. If you have something to say to me, you can communicate through our attorneys. She turned to glare at me. This isn't over, Mr. Kellerman. The board is preparing additional actions against you. You're going to regret not cooperating with us. Is that a threat? Tom asked, pulling out his phone. Because I'm recording this conversation right now? Brenda's eyes widened. You can't record me without my permission. Actually, Arizona is a one-party consent state, I said. Tom has every right to record a conversation he's participating in. Now, please leave. She stormed off to her car, and Tom and I watched her drive away. Thanks for having my back, I said. No problem. That woman is completely out of line. My wife and I have been talking, and we think your tower is actually kind of cool. Our son keeps asking me questions about how radio waves work. Tell him to come over sometime. I'd be happy to give him a demonstration. The hearing on our motion to dismiss was scheduled for October 10th. I took the day off work and met Marcus at the courthouse downtown. The building was a modern structure of glass and concrete, and as we walked through the metal detectors and up to the courtroom, I felt my nerves jangling. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with wood paneling and fluorescent lights that gave everything a slightly harsh glow. Brenda Patterson was already seated at the plaintiff's table with her attorney, Patricia Greenfield. Brenda was wearing another expensive pantsuit, this one navy blue, and she shot me a cold look as I sat down. Judge Robert Harmon entered a few minutes later, a gray-haired man in his 60s with a thoughtful expression. We all stood as he took his seat, and then the hearing began. Patricia Greenfield went first, arguing that the case should proceed because the HOA had a legitimate right to enforce its covenants, and that my tower was a clear violation of those covenants. She claimed that PRB1 did not apply because the HOA was a private organization, not a governmental entity. Marcus stood up for our side, and I could see immediately that he was in his element. He calmly explained that PRB1 explicitly applied to private land use restrictions, not just governmental zoning laws. He cited multiple cases where courts had ruled in favor of amateur radio operators against HOAs. He explained that while HOAs could impose reasonable restrictions on antenna installations, they could not effectively prohibit amateur radio communications. Your Honor, Marcus said, the Saguaro Heights HOA is not seeking reasonable accommodation. They are demanding complete removal of my client's tower, which would make it impossible for him to engage in effective amateur radio communications. This is precisely the type of overreach that PRB1 was designed to prevent. Judge Harmon listened carefully, asking questions of both attorneys. He seemed genuinely interested in understanding the technical aspects of amateur radio and how the tower functioned. At one point, he asked me directly to explain why the tower needed to be 70 feet tall. I stood up nervously. Your Honor, the height of the tower is necessary to achieve the proper radiation pattern for my antenna. Radio waves travel in different ways depending on frequency, and for the frequencies I use, a higher antenna provides better propagation. A shorter antenna would significantly reduce my ability to communicate, especially with distant stations. He nodded thoughtfully. And you're using this for hobby purposes? Yes, Your Honor, but also for emergency communications. Amateur radio operators provide vital communication support during natural disasters and other emergencies when normal communication systems fail. I'm part of the Emergency Communications Network for Maricopa County. Brenda Patterson let out a derisive snort, and the judge's eyes flicked toward her. Is there something you'd like to add, Mrs. Patterson? She stood up, even though she wasn't supposed to speak without her attorney. Your Honor, this is all a smokescreen. Mr. Kellerman could easily use a smaller antenna that doesn't violate our rules. He's just being stubborn and difficult. Judge Harmon's expression hardened. Mrs. Patterson, please let your attorney speak for you. And for the record, the technical requirements of amateur radio operation are not a matter of personal opinion. Patricia Greenfield looked mortified and quickly stood up. I apologize, Your Honor. My client is understandably passionate about this issue. The hearing concluded after about 90 minutes, and Judge Harmon said he would issue a written ruling within 2 weeks. As we left the courtroom, I felt cautiously optimistic. The judge had seemed to understand our arguments, and Brenda's outburst had not helped her case. Marcus and I grabbed coffee at a nearby shop to debrief. "I think that went well," Marcus said. "Judge Harmon seemed sympathetic, and he clearly understands that federal law is on our side. But you never know with judges. Sometimes they surprise you." "How long do you think before we get a ruling?" He said 2 weeks, but it could be longer. Courts move slowly. In the meantime, just keep doing what you're doing. Use your tower, document everything, and don't engage with Brenda Patterson if you can help it. I went back to work the next day, trying to focus on my job as a network administrator for a healthcare company. But the case was never far from my mind. Every time my phone rang, I half expected it to be Marcus with news. The 2-week mark came and went with no ruling. 3 weeks passed, then 4. I started to worry that the judge was having trouble deciding, or worse, that he was going to rule against us. But Marcus assured me that delays were normal and that I shouldn't read too much into the timeline. During this time, the harassment from the HOA continued. I received notices about other supposed violations. My mailbox was the wrong shade of beige, my front yard trees needed trimming, my garbage cans were visible from the street for more than 12 hours after collection day. It was clear that Brenda was conducting a campaign of petty retaliation, trying to make my life difficult in any way she could. I documented every notice, every interaction, and every example of harassment. Marcus said it could be useful if we needed to show a pattern of bad faith on the part of the HOA. Finally, on November 3rd, Marcus called me at work. "We got the ruling. You're going to want to sit down for this." My heart pounded. Good news or bad news? Very good news. Judge Harmon granted our motion to dismiss in its entirety. He ruled that PRB1 preempts the HOA's covenants and that the HOA failed to demonstrate that their restrictions were reasonable. He specifically noted that demanding complete removal of the tower was not a reasonable accommodation. The case is dismissed. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. That's incredible. So I can keep my tower? Yes, and there's more. The judge awarded us attorney's fees. The HOA has to reimburse you for the legal costs of defending this case. I'm still calculating the exact amount, but it should cover most of what you've paid me. I couldn't believe it. Not only had we won, but I was going to get my money back. This is amazing, Marcus. Thank you so much. You're welcome, but be prepared for fallout. Brenda Patterson is not going to take this well. He was right. Within hours of the ruling being posted online, I received an email from the HOA board. It was a terse message stating that the board was disappointed in the court's decision and was considering an appeal. The email also informed me that the board would be conducting a comprehensive review of my property for any and all violations of the CCRs. The next day, a Friday, I came home from work to find Brenda Patterson and 2 other board members walking around my property with clipboards and cameras. They were taking pictures of everything: my house, my yard, my fence, my driveway, and of course, the tower. I stepped outside. "What are you doing? You're on my property without permission." Brenda looked up from her clipboard. "We're conducting an inspection pursuant to Section 12.5 of the CCRs, which grants the board the right to inspect properties to ensure compliance with association rules. That section requires you to give me 48 hours advance written notice," I said. "You can't just walk onto my property whenever you feel like it." "We sent you an email this morning," Brenda said smugly. "An email is not sufficient notice, and 6 hours is not 48 hours. You need to leave my property right now, or I'm calling the police." One of the other board members, a nervous-looking man named Richard Strauss, spoke up. "Brenda, maybe we should reschedule. We don't want to cause more problems." "There's no problem," Brenda said. "We have every right to be here." I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. "Yes, I need to report trespassers on my property." That got their attention. Brenda's face went pale, and Richard looked like he wanted to disappear into the ground. They quickly gathered their things and headed for the street. "This isn't over," Brenda called back. "The board is going to fight that ruling, and we're going to make sure you pay every penny you owe this association." A Scottsdale police officer arrived about 10 minutes later. I explained the situation, showed him the judge's ruling and the email I had received that morning. The officer took notes and said he would file a report documenting the incident. If they come back on your property without proper notice, call us immediately, he said. You have a right to deny them access if they're not following their own rules. After he left, I called Marcus and told him what had happened. I'll send them a cease and desist letter on Monday, he said. This is getting ridiculous. They're harassing you at this point. Over the weekend, I tried to relax and enjoy my victory, but I couldn't shake the feeling that things were going to get worse before they got better. Brenda Patterson struck me as someone who would rather burn down the entire neighborhood than admit she was wrong. On Monday morning, I was proven right. I received a notice in the mail that the HOA board had voted to impose a special assessment of $10,000 on my property to cover the legal fees they had incurred in the case against me. According to the notice, the assessment was being imposed on me alone because I had caused the legal expenses through my refusal to comply with HOA rules. I immediately forwarded the notice to Marcus. "Pfft. This is outrageous," he said when he called me back. "They can't impose a special assessment on you as retaliation. Special assessments have to be applied uniformly to all homeowners or be tied to specific property improvements. This is clearly punitive, and it's probably illegal." So what do? We file another motion, this time alleging harassment and abusive process, and I'm going to recommend that you file a complaint with the Arizona Department of Real Estate. They regulate HOAs in this state, and this kind of behavior could result in sanctions against the board. I filed the complaint with the Department of Real Estate the next day, providing detailed documentation of everything that had happened: the violation notices, the lawsuit, the trespassing incident, and the retaliatory special assessment. The department acknowledged receipt of my complaint and said they would conduct an investigation. Meanwhile, Marcus filed a motion in court challenging the special assessment and asking for sanctions against the HOA for harassment. The motion laid out the entire timeline of events, demonstrating a clear pattern of retaliatory behavior by the board, and specifically by Brenda Patterson. This time, the HOA's attorney, Patricia Greenfield, seemed to recognize they had gone too far. She called Marcus and suggested a settlement conference. Marcus agreed, and we met at his office on a Wednesday afternoon in late November. Patricia arrived alone, without Brenda or any other board members. She looked tired and frustrated. "Let me be frank with you both," she said after we exchanged greetings. "My client has not been listening to my advice. I warned them not to file the original lawsuit, I warned them not to impose the special assessment, and I warned them not to trespass on your property. But Brenda Patterson has been driving this train, and she refuses to accept that she's in the wrong." "So what are you proposing?" Marcus asked. "I'm proposing that we settle this entire matter right now. The HOA will withdraw the special assessment, will formally recognize your right to maintain your tower under federal law, and will agree not to take any further action against you related to the tower. In exchange, you agree to drop the harassment motion and not pursue any further legal action against the association." "What about my attorney's fees?" I asked. "The judge already awarded them, but I haven't seen a penny." "We'll pay them within 30 days. I have a check authorization form right here." She pulled out a document from her briefcase. Marcus looked at me. "What do you think, Wesley?" I thought about it for a moment. Part of me wanted to keep fighting, to make sure Brenda Patterson faced consequences for her behavior. But another part of me was exhausted from months of conflict, and I just wanted it to be over. "I want one more thing," I said. "I want a formal apology from the board, in writing, acknowledging that they violated federal law and treated me unfairly. And I want it posted on the HOA website and sent to every homeowner in the neighborhood." Patricia winced. "Brenda is not going to agree to that." "Then we don't have a deal," I said. "She dragged my name through the mud and tried to paint me as some kind of troublemaker. I want the record set straight." Patricia sighed. "Let me talk to the board. I'll call you by the end of the week." 2 days later, Patricia called Marcus back. "The board agreed to your terms. Brenda fought it, but the other board members outvoted her. We'll have the apology drafted and posted by Monday." The apology was posted on the HOA website the following Monday. It was a short statement acknowledging that the board had been mistaken in its interpretation of the CCRs as they related to amateur radio installations, and that federal law protected my right to maintain my tower. It also apologized for any inconvenience or distress caused by the legal proceedings. It wasn't the full-throated apology I had hoped for, but it was enough. The check for my attorney's fees arrived 2 weeks later, and Marcus confirmed that it covered all of his charges plus the court costs. The special assessment was formally withdrawn, and I received a letter from the board confirming that no further action would be taken regarding my tower. I thought that would be the end of it, but I was wrong. In early January, I received a call from a woman named Linda Morrison, who identified herself as a homeowner in Saguaro Heights. I didn't know her personally, but she said she lived about 6 streets away from me. Mr. Kellerman, I wanted to reach out to you because I think you should know what's been happening at the HOA board meetings. I've been attending them for the past year, and things have gotten really weird. What do you mean? I asked. Brenda Patterson has become completely obsessed with you and your tower. At the last 3 meetings, she's spent most of the time ranting about how you disrespected the board and how you're setting a dangerous precedent. She's been pushing for all kinds of new rules that seem designed specifically to target you. Last month, she proposed a new rule that would require all homeowners with amateur radio equipment to pay a $5,000 annual licensing fee to the HOA. That's insane, and probably illegal. That's what several board members said. Richard Strauss actually resigned from the board because he said Brenda was creating a hostile environment. There's been talk of removing her as president, but she has a couple of allies on the board who support her no matter what. Why are you telling me this? Because I think Brenda might be planning something. She's been having closed-door meetings with her attorney, and she's been very secretive about what they're discussing. I wanted to warn you to be careful. I thanked Linda for the information and immediately called Marcus to let him know what was happening. This woman is relentless, Marcus said. Keep documenting everything and let me know if anything else happens. If she tries anything illegal, we'll shut it down fast. A few weeks later, I found out what Brenda had been planning. I received a notice from the city of Scottsdale informing me that a complaint had been filed claiming my tower violated city building codes. The notice said an inspector would be visiting my property to investigate the complaint. I knew immediately that Brenda was behind this. My tower had been permitted and inspected by the city when it was installed, and everything was in perfect compliance with building codes. This was just another harassment tactic. The city inspector showed up on a Thursday morning. His name was Greg Foster, and he was a middle-aged man with a no-nonsense demeanor. I showed him all of my permits and the engineering reports for the tower. He spent about an hour examining the installation, taking measurements and checking the foundation. Everything looks good to me, he finally said. Your tower is properly permitted and installed to code. I don't know who filed this complaint, but it was baseless. I have a pretty good idea who filed it, I said. I've been having a dispute with my HOA president, and she's been trying to force me to remove this tower. Greg nodded sympathetically. I've seen this before. HOA disputes get nasty sometimes. Well, I'll file my report saying everything is in compliance. That should close the matter. But it didn't close the matter. Over the next 2 months, I received 3 more complaints from the city, each one claiming different violations: improper grounding, inadequate setback from property lines, and unsafe guy wire anchors. Each time, a city inspector came out, found no violations, and closed the complaint. And each time, I became more convinced that Brenda Patterson was abusing the system to harass me. After the 4th false complaint, I decided I had had enough. I filed a police report alleging that Brenda Patterson was filing false reports with the city in order to harass me. I provided documentation of all the complaints and the inspector reports showing they were baseless. The police took the report, but they said there wasn't much they could do unless I could prove Brenda was the one filing the complaints. The city complaints were anonymous, and without direct evidence linking her to them, they couldn't pursue charges. I was feeling increasingly frustrated and trapped. No matter what I did, Brenda Patterson seemed determined to make my life miserable. I started to wonder if I should just sell my house and move somewhere else, somewhere without an HOA. But then something unexpected happened. In late March, I received a call from Richard Strauss, the former HOA board member who had resigned. Mr. Kellerman, I need to talk to you about something important. Can we meet in person? We met at a coffee shop near the neighborhood. Richard looked nervous, constantly glancing around as if he was afraid of being seen. I'm coming to you because I think what Brenda has been doing is wrong, and I have evidence that proves it, he said quietly. He pulled out a folder and slid it across the table to me. Inside were printed copies of emails between Brenda Patterson and Patricia Greenfield, the HOA attorney. The emails detailed a coordinated effort to file anonymous complaints against me with the city, with Brenda explicitly instructing Patricia to file the complaints using different names and email addresses to avoid detection. "How did you get these?" I asked, my heart racing. I was still on the HOA email distribution list for a few weeks after I resigned, and these came through before they removed me. I've been sitting on them because I wasn't sure what to do, but after I heard about the fourth complaint, I knew I had to give them to you. What Brenda is doing is illegal, and she needs to be stopped. I immediately took the emails to Marcus. He read through them carefully, his expression growing more serious with each page. "This is smoking gun evidence of abuse of process and filing false reports with a government agency," he said. "These are serious crimes. I think we need to take this to the police and the county attorney's office." We made an appointment with a detective at the Scottsdale Police Department. Detective Sarah Morrison, no relation to Linda who had warned me earlier, reviewed the emails and took detailed statements from both me and Richard Strauss. "This is definitely criminal behavior," Detective Morrison said. "Filing false reports with the city is a crime under Arizona law, and doing it repeatedly as part of a harassment campaign makes it even more serious. I'm going to open an investigation and get a warrant for Mrs. Patterson's records." Over the next few weeks, the investigation proceeded. Detective Morrison obtained records from Patricia Greenfield's law office, which confirmed that she had filed the complaints at Brenda's direction. When confronted, Patricia immediately cooperated with the investigation, providing additional documentation and testifying that Brenda had pressured her to file the false complaints. On a warm afternoon in April, I was working in my garage when I saw a police car pull up to Brenda Patterson's house, which was about 4 streets away from mine. I walked to the end of my driveway and watched as Detective Morrison and another officer went to the door. A few minutes later, they emerged with Brenda in handcuffs. It was one of the most surreal moments of my life. The woman who had made the past year of my life a living nightmare was being arrested, and I had a front row seat to watch it happen. Brenda was charged with 4 counts of making false reports to law enforcement, each count corresponding to one of the fraudulent complaints filed with the city. She was also charged with harassment and abuse of process. Patricia Greenfield, the attorney, was charged as an accomplice for her role in filing the complaints. The arrest made local news. The story of an HOA president so obsessed with taking down a ham radio tower that she committed multiple crimes generated a lot of attention. Several news outlets contacted me for interviews, and I agreed to talk to a reporter from the Arizona Republic who did a fair and balanced story about the situation. The publicity had an immediate effect on the HOA. At an emergency meeting held a week after Brenda's arrest, the board voted to remove her as president and appoint Richard Strauss, who had rejoined the board, as interim president. The board also voted to adopt new policies specifically protecting homeowners' rights to install amateur radio equipment in compliance with federal law. Brenda's criminal case moved slowly through the court system. She initially pleaded not guilty and tried to argue that she had been acting in the best interests of the HOA. But the evidence against her was overwhelming, and in July she accepted a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to 2 counts of making false reports and 1 count of harassment. The other charges were dismissed as part of the deal. She was sentenced to 1 year of probation, 200 hours of community service, and a $5,000 fine. She was also ordered to pay restitution to me for the time and expenses I had incurred dealing with the false complaints. The judge was particularly harsh in his sentencing remarks, noting that Brenda had abused her position of authority in the HOA and had wasted valuable city resources with her false complaints. Patricia Greenfield, the attorney, had her law license suspended for 6 months and was ordered to complete ethics training. She also had to pay a fine to the State Bar Association. In August, the Arizona Department of Real Estate concluded its investigation into the HOA's conduct. The department issued a formal reprimand against the Saguaro Heights HOA board for its handling of my case and ordered the association to implement new governance training for all board members. The department also imposed a $10,000 fine on the association, which had to be paid from the general fund rather than being passed on to homeowners. Through all of this, I continued using my ham radio tower every day. I made contacts with operators all over the world, participated in emergency communications drills, and even taught a few local kids about amateur radio. My neighbors, for the most part, had been supportive throughout the ordeal, and several of them had reached out to apologize for not speaking up sooner against Brenda's harassment. Tom Henderson, my neighbor who had stood up to Brenda in my driveway that day, became a good friend. His son developed a real interest in amateur radio, and I helped him study for his technician class license exam. He passed on his first try, and we set up a small antenna in their backyard so he could start making his own contacts. In September, almost exactly 1 year after Brenda Patterson first pulled into my driveway to complain about my tower, the HOA held its annual meeting to elect new board members. Richard Strauss ran for president and won in a landslide. Several other new members were elected, people who were committed to running the HOA fairly and reasonably. At that meeting, Richard made a point of publicly acknowledging the mistakes the previous board had made in my case. He thanked me for standing up for my rights and said the entire situation had been a learning experience for the community. After the meeting, several homeowners came up to me to introduce themselves and thank me for fighting the good fight. One woman told me her son was considering getting into amateur radio and asked if I would be willing to mentor him. Another man said he had always wanted to put up an antenna but had been afraid of HOA pushback, and now he felt comfortable moving forward with his plans. As I drove home that night, I reflected on everything that had happened. It had been an exhausting, frustrating, and often frightening year. There had been times when I had seriously considered giving up, selling my house, and moving somewhere without an HOA. But I was glad I had stood my ground, not just for me, but for all the other amateur radio operators who might face similar challenges in the future. The law was on my side, and thanks to PRB1 and decades of precedent protecting amateur radio operators, I had been able to keep my tower and continue pursuing my passion. But more than that, I had helped change the culture of my HOA, making it a more reasonable and fair organization that respected homeowners' rights. My tower still stands today, rising 70 feet into the Arizona sky. Every time I look at it, I feel a sense of pride and accomplishment. It's more than just a metal structure. It's a symbol of standing up for what's right, even when powerful people try to stop you. I continued to use my radio regularly, making contacts around the world and participating in emergency communications networks. I became more involved in the Scottsdale Amateur Radio Club, eventually serving as vice president. I helped several other operators deal with their own HOA issues, sharing the lessons I had learned and connecting them with legal resources when necessary. As for Brenda Patterson, I occasionally saw her around the neighborhood during her probation period. She always looked away when our paths crossed, never acknowledging me. After her probation ended, she and her husband quietly moved out of Saguaro Heights. I heard through the neighborhood gossip network that they had relocated to a gated community in Fountain Hills. I hoped, for the sake of her new neighbors, that she had learned something from her experience, but somehow I doubted it. The Saguaro Heights HOA became something of a model for other associations in the area. Richard Strauss implemented transparent governance practices, regular communication with homeowners, and fair enforcement of rules. The association even created a special committee to review the CCRs and update them to comply with federal and state laws, including specific provisions recognizing homeowners' rights to install amateur radio equipment. My legal battle became a teaching case in Arizona for both HOA law and amateur radio rights. Marcus Chen gave several presentations at legal conferences about the case, and it was cited in training materials for HOA board members. The Arizona chapter of the American Radio Relay League, the National Association for Amateur Radio Operators, recognized me with an award for defending amateur radio rights, but perhaps the most satisfying outcome was the impact on my immediate community. In the 2 years following the resolution of my case, 3 other homeowners in Saguaro Heights installed amateur radio antennas without any interference from the HOA. The neighborhood had learned that diversity in hobbies and interests made the community stronger, not weaker. One of those new operators was Tom Henderson's son, Kevin, who was now 16 years old and completely hooked on amateur radio. We often operated together, entering contests and working on special event stations. Watching his enthusiasm reminded me of why I had fought so hard to keep my tower. Amateur radio wasn't just a hobby. It was a way of connecting with people, learning about technology, and being prepared to help in emergencies. Those were values worth fighting for. In the spring, almost 2 years after Brenda's arrest, I received an unexpected letter in the mail. It was from Patricia Greenfield, the attorney who had represented the HOA and had been charged alongside Brenda. In the letter, she apologized for her role in the harassment and explained that she had been going through some personal issues at the time and had let a difficult client push her into making unethical decisions. She said she had completed her ethics training and had decided to focus her law practice on helping HOAs operate more fairly and transparently. I wasn't sure how to feel about the letter. Part of me was still angry at Patricia for enabling Brenda's behavior, but another part of me appreciated that she had taken responsibility for her actions and was trying to make amends. I decided to respond with a short note accepting her apology and wishing her well in her efforts to reform HOA practices. Life gradually returned to normal. My job continued to go well, and I was promoted to senior network administrator at the healthcare company where I worked. I started dating a woman named Laura Matthews, who I met at a community emergency response training session. She thought my ham radio tower was fascinating and even got her own technician license so we could operate together. On a cool evening in November, almost exactly 2 years after the judge had dismissed the HOA's lawsuit against me, I was in my radio room making contacts when I heard a particularly clear signal from a station in New Zealand. We had a long conversation about antenna design and propagation conditions, and toward the end of our contact, he asked me about my station setup. I described my 70-foot tower and the antennas mounted on it, and I briefly mentioned the legal battle I had fought to keep it. "Good on you, mate," the operator in New Zealand said. "We need more people willing to stand up for amateur radio rights. These towers and antennas are important, not just for our hobby, but for emergency communications and international goodwill." After we signed off, I sat back in my chair and looked at all the equipment around me. The transceivers, the amplifiers, the antenna tuners, and the computer logging my contacts. Through the window, I could see my tower lit by the glow of the red obstacle light at its top, standing tall against the night sky. I had fought for this, and I had won. Not just in court, but in the larger battle for the right to pursue my passion without unreasonable interference. The experience had taught me that sometimes standing up for yourself means standing up for principles that are bigger than any one person. PRB1 existed because amateur radio operators decades ago had fought similar battles and established the legal framework that protected my rights today. I thought about all the operators around the country who might be facing their own HOA battles right now, feeling alone and overwhelmed. I hoped that my story would give them encouragement and help them understand that the law was on their side. I hoped that HOAs would learn from the mistakes of Saguaro Heights and choose to work with amateur radio operators rather than against them. As I shut down my station for the night and headed inside, I felt a deep sense of contentment. My tower would stand for many years to come, a testament to the power of persistence, the importance of federal protections, and the value of a community that had learned to embrace diversity and respect individual rights. The battle had been worth fighting, and the victory was sweet not just for me, but for every amateur radio operator who would benefit from the precedent we had set. The night was clear and cool, perfect for radio propagation. Tomorrow I would be back on the air, making new contacts and continuing the amateur radio tradition that had meant so much to me for so many years. But tonight, I simply stood in my backyard and looked up at my tower, feeling grateful for the fight I had won and the community that had ultimately supported me.